Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
Namaste viewers, welcome to Jaipur Dialogue USA. Today we are going to talk about a subject which seems to be occurring with a periodical timing. Violence in America, gun violence in America. Recently we saw another 21 kids killed in one of the states recently. I'm sorry for this because my dog is walking, so my camera is shaking. Now he is gone, so thank you. So the important part is the violence in America is, the epitome of democracy all over the world, that everybody wants to be an American. America tries to export its own ideology of democracy, but we are not able to protect our children, our people. And so many people die because of gun violence. And I'll put it violence first. Gun is a concomitant research on that. To discuss this matter, we have great pleasure in welcoming Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor. Ambassador Pradeep Kapoorji is, very famous. He has been in ambassadorial roles. You are mute, sir. Ambassadorial role all over the world. And recently, he has written a book on healthcare. I have promised him a separate dialogue on that book, and we will have it there, Pradeepji. I'm also expecting Dr. Nathan Punwani to join us. Somewhere along the line, he is stuck. So we will welcome him. But in the meanwhile, I wanted all of you to subscribe, like, and share the channel, because just as Jaipur Dialogue India, we are trying to build a narrative in the United States for Indians living here and non-Indians who are listening to us to become aware of who we are, why we do things the way we are. This is very important. So please like, subscribe, and press the bell icon for Jaipur Dialogue USA as you subscribe to Jaipur Dialogue. So Ambassador Pradeep Kapoorji, there is a very interesting data that I got into when I was doing my research on Pew Research, as you know, did a research, and they had a finding of 2020, which they said that in 2020, 45,222 people died because of gun-related violence. Nathan, welcome to. I recognize you are from California, so it may be a little early for you. So welcome.
All right, that's what we'll coffee's for.
All right, thank you, Nathan. So just talking about this element that 45,222 deaths happened in the US in gun-related violence at the data is of 2020. What was interesting, that 43% of them were gun murders, but 54% were gun-related suicides. That data somewhere along the line gets submerged because of the violence that causes deaths. And 611 exact number was due to law enforcement, and 400 about which were circumstances which were not determined. So Ambassador, tell us something. You have been here, you have traveled the world. How does US fail to control the gun-related violence? What is it about its so-called freedoms and Second Amendment that gives the people the right to own a gun, to fight against the state tyranny, by the way? It was originally designed as such. It was not about hunting, it was not about anything else, but it was to fight state tyranny. Your thoughts, please.
Thank you. First of all, I want to congratulate Jaipur Dialogues, both in the US and India, for the phenomenal work that you're doing to foster and enhance these relations between our two countries, which are very critical for the future of the world also, and discussing such important topics like gun violence in the US. Now, you have mentioned in your preamble about how there is such a vast amount of gun violence and the background of trying to combat state tyranny. But it is not just that. If we go further back into history, part of the reason when I talk to my friends here in the US, I try to learn and understand why are they so attached to their guns and their right to guns. Because many times I say that, this has to be given up for the common good, for the greater good of society. but they argue very vehemently. So then I tried to delve a little deeper, and I realized that long back, 100, 200 years back, over 200 years back, when the migrants from Europe were trying to settle into this continent, they had to fight with the Red Indians, and guns were a very important source of their victory over the Red Indians through whatever means, germs and other aspects and violence. But guns were the primary source of their success or the humiliation or genocide of the Red Indians. Now, when you had the Afro Americans, the blacks coming into the continent as slaves, again, to keep that image of strength and power and control, and to keep them subdued, you again needed a lot of guns. So, what shocks me today is that that aspect of the psychology of our country has not undergone a change, has not evolved too much. Because when I hear them saying that we have our full right, now, a right to guns also dictates to right to assault weapons, right to war weapons, right to weapons which are used by the army, which are very, very phenomenally, can create a lot of violence and death, as we have seen. Now, Australia, faced with a similar situation a few years back, what did it do? It saw the levels of deaths going up very significantly over the years, because the people there also had a right to gun. They changed the laws completely from ground level upwards. And they had an incentive scheme where they said that if you surrender your guns, you get so much money. And most of the people surrendered their guns. And those guns were utilized elsewhere or burnt away, etc. They could have been better utilized probably by the army or police services. But many of these weapons were burnt. What happened thereafter? The statistics show that suddenly the level of violence in that society dropped very significantly. So, something similar has to happen here. And back to you, Vibhuti.
Thank you very much for giving the historical perspective of how the natives lost to the colonizers because of the superior instrument of death called gun. I would put it that way. Like the old timers, they say that the discovery of Barood led to the change of warfare in many parts of the world. So, Nathan, I'm coming to you. Welcome back to you. This is your first time on Jaipur Dialogue USA or Jaipur Dialogue.
Thank you for having me, Vibhuti ji.
No, you are definitely, you are a second generation Indian here, if I'm very correct in guessing that. And you are also very deeply involved, in addition to your life-saving venture as a physician, into improving Indo-US relationship, because you lead a pack. You are part of a pack that is working very well on that. So welcome to the show. Straight jumping into the entire process. Ambassador Kapoor, you mentioned about the assault weapons. Tell us something about the assault weapons, because there was another Pew data which was very interesting as I was looking for it. More than 79% of all murders were done by firearms. The 79% of the total murders that happened, which amounts to 19,384 at the end of 2020. Handguns, 3% were the assault weapons. So do you realize that 3% of assault weapons, shotguns were 1%? Rest of it was what? That data is not clear. So tell us something more about it. You are an American. You are born here. You know about the Second Amendment. Tell us your thoughts on this entire situation the way it is.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. It's very tragic what's happened in the last, really in the last month, we had, mass shootings in Buffalo because of a white nationalist. And then now we had, this tragic shooting and mass violence in Uvalde. And as a physician, guns are a public health issue. Unfortunately, it really comes down to the American people. And, if you look at Gallup survey after Gallup survey, 52% of adults want stricter gun laws. But I think at the end of the day, you have a United States Congress that's constitutionally designed to not necessarily follow the mass of the masses. So even though you might actually have a majority, you might have a consensus among the American people in terms of some very reasonable gun restrictions, or at least some gun regulations. The way the United States Senate, for example, is set up, you need at least 60% of the Senate to agree for legislation to come through. And that gives an outsized importance to rural states where gun control or gun ownership is much higher and where gun control is much less popular. And you've seen a spate of Democrats actually since the repeal of since the assault weapons ban was introduced in the 90s. It later expired in the 2000s, but you actually saw a lot of Democrats lose their election over it. So, and these were all from rural states, states like Montana, and even some, you would think some Democratic leaning states like Vermont and Maine, the gun control is very, very unpopular. So I think at the end of the day, it comes down to, in order to get anything passed the United States Congress, such as gun control, you need a very deep-seated consensus, and you have to actually get rural states on board for any kind of legislation to make it through the Senate. And unfortunately, we lack that consensus, even though, survey after survey indicates most Americans, there seems to be at least some crystallization of support for things like background checks, a mental health registry to restrict firearm sales to people who are, depressed or, suffer from schizophrenia. I think there's a lot of support behind those individual pieces of policy, but it's very difficult to get it through.
No, it's a very important point you made, because after the first ever 1999 Columbine shooting that happened, where two seniors went on a rampage, killed as many children, colleagues, friends, and, which was a huge tragedy. Those two seniors attributed their revenge to bullying that they faced in school. Now, you attributed very correctly the mental issues. Today, it's funny that the legal system, even the terrorists are now falling into the category of mental instability caused by you, me, and everybody else put together. So it is becoming a joke, that mental thing, and it's serious too at the same time, because there are children who could be facing severe case of mental stress. Because I remember this, but I'll tell you this very frankly, when I came to this country, I eased off the peer pressure from my son by telling him that if ever you encounter peer pressure in school to use cigarette, drugs, or anything that you are required to do because of peer pressure, I told him a very funny thing. I told him, tell your friends that you have promised your first cigarette, your first shot, your first cocaine with me. I told him that. So what happened was, as a result of which he asked me, do you mean it? I said, yes, I mean it. Believe it or not, it eased off the pressure. We have to devise our own ways to do that. Recently, we saw a very dirty video in which a young boy in Colorado or Oregon, I don't remember exactly where he's being suffocated. Chokehold was going on him. This video went rampant.
I saw that. Yes.
Yeah. People came up with very strange kind of stories that the Indian boy was guilty of instigating the Brazilian white guy, so-called, and whatever there may be the situation. The issue is violence the way? Is it the way? So bullying is a very important factor. Children are under enormous stress. Gun becomes available, they take the revenge. And, you can't find a solution to that. Behind this school shooting is tragic because children die. And the children die, they could be Latinos, they could be white, they could be black, they could be anyone. Children dying in such a heinous way is not acceptable. What are the solutions? What must America do? Putting a guard in school, putting an armed guard, is that a solution? We saw that in this particular instance, the police officers admitted that their response was incorrect. So schools always object to and resist police presence on their campus. What is the politics of it, Ambassador Kapoor Saab?
Thank you. Thank you, Vibhuti. That's a very important question. First of all, my heart goes out to those families
Yes.
who have suffered this particular tragedy and the earlier tragedy. To have your little child whose whole life is ahead of him, die absolutely senselessly, without any reason or without any purpose. And it's very, very sad. And it's very, very unfortunate. I can hardly imagine the condition of those parents whose little blossoming flower, is no more. So, our condolences to all those families and the parents very profoundly through your channel. Now, when I hear about this particular solution to gun violence, to have more guns, to put a gun in the classroom, to train the teachers with, gun practice, how to use those guns, to have guards. And it's absolutely mind-boggling for me. It's absolutely shocking. Instead of finding a solution which would be more practical to reduce the violence, and the amount of effort required to control those guns and the sense of irresponsible power and authority which that gun gives will only lead to further violence. How can you? It's like Gandhiji's quotation that you cannot answer violence by violence. You have to have a very firm, practical, anti-violence, non-violent stand. So that is what needs to be fostered. And Dr. Nathan Punwani has talked very nicely about the rural communities having the power of vote, etc., and their representatives not therefore being feeling empowered. But I think this has gone beyond that stage now. It has to happen in a national dialogue. Rules have to be changed. Methods have to be found on how to change those rules so that this country does not keep on witnessing this as a serial one after another, as it's happening episodically. Why should it happen? How do you stop it completely is the question which everybody has to be asked, and everybody has to ask themselves, and everybody has to find answers, and thereafter the answers will emerge. Thank you.
Nathan, tell us something about this element of constitutional protection and the element that, why Americans are so fond of guns. Because I'm contesting an election on Republican ticket. You know the Republican point of view in this regard. They are champions of gun rights. At the same time, extreme views hold no semblance of what you call agreement. There has to be a common ground found, because there is no way one can tolerate or accept the killings that happen. And Ambassador Kapoor has a point that you can't give guns in everybody's hand. That's not a solution. It's not a deterrent. It becomes an encouragement then. I have a gun.
It's adding to the problems. It's adding to the problems.
It adds to the problem. So how does one address that issue in a sane manner?
So I think in terms of the politics of it, remember, you're a New York Republican, and actually New York Republicans actually push for some of the toughest gun laws in the country. And actually, many liberals may not want to admit it, but when Rudy Giuliani was mayor of New York City, he actually made it very difficult for gun ownership, and the NRA was not happy with that. So, if you look at some of the history of gun control, you would actually see that even Governor Reagan, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, he was a Republican, conservative. He also pushed for gun control when he was governor. So there is a history of Republicans supporting gun control. Well, if you look at the politics of it, the major change was in the 90s when President Clinton took up the issue of gun control. And at that point, you had increased polarization in the United States where over the last 10, 20 years, people who were gun aficionados migrated into the Republican Party. Part of it was accelerated by the NRA. They did a very good public relations campaign where they tied gun ownership with values that are considered very uniquely American, like rugged individualism, self-reliance. And those, if you think about it, those are philosophies, those are certainly instincts that resonate with Republican voters. So I think you had a natural confluence with increased polarization and the NRA's campaign to really tie gun ownership to things that the Republican Party seemed to really uphold. And as a result, that's how you had this connection. I think on the one hand, you can push for all the policies you want, whether it's an assault weapons ban or something more moderate, which is what Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Pat Toomey proposed with background checks. I think one of the things that needs to be seen is how much the Supreme Court will also intervene when it comes to gun control. So increasingly, the Supreme Court has adopted a very maximalist interpretation of the Second Amendment. And even if states like California and New York push for more gun control, they're going to actually have to really understand that there's a counterweight of a Supreme Court, a United States Supreme Court, that is upholding gun ownership, striking down state laws. And actually this June, we should be hearing a case, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, that the Supreme Court has actually looked into, and they're set to give a verdict in just next month. And there, it's the issue at hand was New York, the state of New York, so your state, Vibhuti, is denying petitioners applications for concealed carry licenses for self-defense. And the Supreme Court here is saying it's likely to say that that's in stark contradiction to the Second Amendment. And I think that law could get struck down. So I think as long as you have this counterweight of Supreme Court, which is based on the records of the justices, it's increasingly likely that the Second Amendment, no matter what the United States Congress even does, it's going to get struck down by the Supreme Court. So I'm overall fairly pessimistic of further gun control efforts in the United States, at least for the next 10 years.
Oh, okay. That's a pretty fascinating insight that you gave here, the politics of gun control and the entire scenario. But earlier, before you came in, Ambassador Kapoor had mentioned that the gun gave the colonizers overwhelming superiority when it came to subjugating the natives. And that's how the gun right is embedded into the culture of America. That, having said that, it is also very important that these are issues, they have impact and implication to the image of America. And that is very concerning, because right now we are unable to protect our children in our school. And guns are killing. Gun-related issues are killing people. How can we, as Americans, champion American democracy in the rest of the world when we are unable to protect our own children, citizens? Look at Chicago. I mean, the only news from Chicago that comes is how many people were killed on a daily basis. The violence is pretty big, and Chicago is a highly gun-controlled city or state. Illinois is one of them. How does one reconcile this then, Ambassador? You have been in the world of diplomacy and you have seen policies play out. How does one reconcile with this? Whatever the politics of it may be, how does one reconcile with the challenge of mass killings because one can acquire a gun to do so? And I will preface it with one more item, and I'll come to the doctor with that thought, that even before guns were invented or brought about, people were killing. There were even more deadly wars that happened, including, I would say, the Kalinga War, in which Ashoka, after winning the war, lamented that I had to kill so many people to run a kingdom. And he abandoned war as a state policy for himself. But people were killing even before guns were there. Your thoughts, Ambassador?
Well, Nathan has pointed out the factual picture. I am always an optimist. What I'd like to say is the following, that a time will come when it will become absolutely clear in the minds of a majority of Americans that this is not the right way to go ahead as a country. You may need 100 Mahatma Gandhis in the US who will propagate this philosophy and thought, or you may need some other. It's not the last incident which has happened, unfortunately. So the incidents which may happen in the future may be much worse. And once they start impacting the people who are supporting, rights to guns, the Second Amendment, NRA, and they see it closer and closer home, how it is impacting them directly, then their minds and thoughts will start changing. So you do require a national movement on a massive scale. Is not something which can be done easily because it's so deeply embedded in your thought, in your psyche, in your mind, in your body, in your hands, that to make a change will be a very difficult job, but it is not something which people have to give up hope. Supreme Court is going to be another great barrier to overcome, definitely, but it has to be done for the future of America. Thank you.
Nathan, wanted to check with you on this very subject matter again. Your thoughts on this, because at the end of the day, as the saying goes, like I came to this country in '91. The two issues which are still lingering on ever since then is comprehensive immigration reform and the gun control. It seems to be that the debate and dialogue is unending, and each side is stuck to its position. And as the saying goes, politics is about their own truth. Each party has its own element of truth, as a very famous Sanskrit word, ardha satya, their own half truths, which truth you believe in. So, like Ambassador Kapoor talked about a national movement, 100 Gandhis or 100 Martin Luther Kings coming to this country. At which point in time, people will feel this is the last straw on the camel's back?
And I think I think what the ambassador enumerates here really is that voters actually have to care about the issues. So this is a phenomena that political scientists on not just this issue, but on countless other issues talks about. This is the end result, a sequela, when you have a well-organized block of single-issue voters. So in the case of gun control, you actually have a well-organized block of voters who only vote because of their gun. And if they own a gun, they will, this is the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 issues that they will only vote on. And they'll punish any lawmaker who proposes even modest gun restrictions. Whereas other voters who may not own a gun, who actually would support gun control, they don't actually vote on that issue. They might be polled and they might indicate support for taking up or helping a candidate who supports gun control, but they won't actually vote for that candidate. They might vote because of some other issue, maybe whether it's taxes or the environment, climate change, or whatever, but they don't actually vote on the issue of gun control. So until you actually have a well-organized block of single-issue gun control supporters to counter the gun activists, the pro-gun activists, I think at the end of the day, this is why our politics are stymied on this particular issue.
That's pretty fascinating. Should there be a national referendum because politicians are not able to solve the crisis? Does this need a statewide or a national referendum to allow guns the way it is being done? There are background checks and all this. This is what bothers me a lot more. And this is on the diplomatic and international arms business part of it. United States and all the other 4 Security Council members, are the largest sellers of weapons around the world. And we talk about world peace. Can't happen. We know that war has been going on incessantly ever since nations have been formed. For territorial gain, ideological weaponry, where does it stop? Is war an endemic part? Is violence an endemic part of the human mind that fight it out? Gun battle at OK Corral, the Wild West. Men get into the rings, mixed martial arts, bash each other up. Is violence part of our life? Or is that the reason we want to have superior weaponry to win the war? Where does it go? Where does it really, how does it really help? Does war really help? Although in Hinduism, there is a thing called Dharma Yuddha. I'm totally cognizant of that fact. You have to be ready for war to maintain peace. Your thought, Ambassador?
Well, it's a very philosophical question you're raising, Vibhuti ji. And war is, of course, expanding into space, expanding into satellite technology and hypersonic missiles. So all the developments in technology are also accelerating the weaponry available to countries. So, and that side will continue in its own way, in its own path. But that doesn't mean that the efforts on the other side also need, like you had the international, treaties, the
Mhm.
START, for example,
Correct.
strategic arms limitation talks, etc., SALT, controlling of nuclear weapons. So that sort of effort has to also continue on the side, and there have to be certain limits to aspect of weaponization also. Particularly internally, this is a domestic issue for the US. This is our adopted country, for example. Now, this is not something where outsiders have to weigh in and come in and say that this is required. It's the people of the US who have to rise against this violence. And you have to say that, okay, NRA had its day, it made its money. Now it needs to move ahead and look at other channels or diversify, like they talk about trade diversification. NRA needs to also look at other sources of revenue rather than just guns and bullets. Thank you.
Nathan, last question, last point on this particular conversation before we shift to mutually agreed upon topic, important topic of Indo-Pacific economic framework. But the issue is very important. Ambassador Kapoor said it is a domestic matter, but violence is a universal phenomenon. Killing is a universal phenomenon. Wars are a universal phenomenon. So from that point of view, if you look at it, Germany, Spain, Australia, Canada have a data of less than 2 per 100,000 deaths related to gun. United States is 10.1, according to Pew Research. And the countries that have El Salvador, Venezuela, Guatemala have over more than 32 deaths per 100,000. Colombia has 26, Honduras has 23. Majority of people are coming from these areas to us. Is there a possibility that the guns violence is only a white man's problem or it's Indians' problem? Who is causing this? Where is the mix of people? That also needs to be understood given the data. It's not that I'm saying so. It's
Yeah,
important.
and Vibhuti, what you're really outlining here is that culture ultimately matters.
Yes.
And how much of it is just an American phenomena? Is it also a Western phenomena? I like to point out that, in Switzerland, guns are very much ubiquitous. There's 2 million guns in the country in a population of 8 million people. And in spite of that, homicide rates are close to zero each year.
Right.
So I think that's something to illustrate that it's clearly not a white man's issue, because Switzerland is very much a gun-toting country, and you don't see this culture of violence. I was also in Israel in 2018, and guns are certainly very much conspicuous. You go on a train station, you'll see people carrying guns, but I think you also saw a level of maturity about the gun. I think there is something about national service, national military service that's obligatory for the Israeli population that really engenders a respect for weaponry, and then an understanding that this isn't something to be trifled with. And so I think that ultimately these are all things that weigh in on a culture. And in the United States, where guns are very much available, but oftentimes we've actually overseen just so much societal degeneration, lack of parental responsibility. The media certainly glorifies violence. And then you see with the internet, so much depersonalization that it's very much easy to get a gun and then abuse it. So, I think at the end of the day, this seems like it's very much an American problem. And then some of the points you made, when there's a lot of gun violence in El Salvador and, much of Central America, but that's largely a separate issue. That's because of organized cartels and the stranglehold that they have over those countries. By and large, if you look at, I think the surveys, I haven't looked at it specifically, but generally gun ownership in the US is lowest among minorities when it comes to, especially Latinos. If there are guns that are involved, it's almost always illegal. These were unregistered firearms that are being purchased, but they're, for the most part, they're not really glorified in any of those communities, especially among the Latin American community. You don't see that. And I think part of it is also just there's a lot of family values in that community. They're very church going, and a lot of them are very entrepreneurial. So, they channel their energies elsewhere, and they really promote family values. So, I think this is kind of, if you look at it, this is very much kind of a white centric problem in the United States. And it's, although you don't see it in whites elsewhere around the world, like in a country like Switzerland or in Israel.
That's a very fascinating observation you made, Nathan. Thank you very much, because it's important. Culture plays a big role. We haven't come across, and I say that proudly, that Indians are going on a killing rampage. It's part of a cultural makeup of people and the mind and come from. And everybody comes to America to do well. Nobody comes to America to become unsafe. Nobody comes to America to remain poor. Or depend on the government largesses to live a life at a common minimum program. People come here because they want to prosper. And that's the good part. And God bless this country. We are all part of this one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's switch tracks. We are doing it for the first time, that generally we devote the whole time for one topic. So violence in America was the topic. But there is something important happen, which is happening on the other side of the world. That famous Bill Clinton statement is, the economy is stupid. So Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, remember, it is called a framework. It's not called an agreement or an agenda. It's a framework being worked out to create an Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for economic development. And interestingly, China is not part of that membership. And there were certain critical words that I read. This framework is intended to advance resilience, sustainability, inclusiveness, economic growth, fairness, and competitiveness for our economies. Through this initiative, we aim to contribute to cooperation, stability, prosperity, development, and peace within the region. This is entirely written by some very smart diplomatic corps guy. Every good word is mentioned here. So, Ambassador Kapoor, I'll come to you with that. These are universal truths. What is so fascinating about this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? The one thing which makes me very happy, it begins with Indo-Pacific. Your thoughts on this?
Thank you for raising this issue.
I'm paying compliment to your service to have put in all significant words in one sentence. You can't argue with that.
No, well, I guess, and the world knows that a lot of the drafting is done by Indian Foreign Service officers, even at the United Nations. So I'm quite sure that the Indian diplomats would have contributed significantly to the drafting, along with the Americans and the other partners in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Now, framework is a nomenclature used in the initial part of discussions. It thereafter evolves into either a forum or a treaty or an agreement or a group. So that'll happen. Now, it's a very important step because the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was being put together earlier by the Obama administration, was dismantled thereafter by the Trump administration. Now, that was a similar framework where China was excluded. Now, with the increasing threat perception being faced by the US on so many fronts, including the economic front, the trade front, the strategic front, the security front, the military front, from China, particularly, this sort of initiative was expected and it has come through. It will start off as making a commitment towards, you know, supply chain resilience, towards free trade, towards digital economy, towards infrastructure for that, for 5G, for example, towards blockchain technology, towards industry 5.0. So all those aspects will become more and more important as we go along. And exclusion of China particularly will, make this grouping sort of more focused in a way towards keeping the sea lanes open for trade also, besides for security purposes. So I think it's a very good development for the future of a democracy and for the future of the free world. It's an excellent step and it will gain a lot of momentum. There will be a lot of other countries which will thereafter want to join very soon once this framework evolves a little bit further. And that only will strengthen the, democratic foundation of the world in a very significant manner in the years and decades ahead. Thank you.
Very well said, sir. Nathan, I'm coming to that on, there's a very important data that came out today, where in United States has replaced China as the largest trade partner. The number now reads 119.42 billion for financial year 22, surpassing China, which is about 115 or something like that. But the leap is huge, which is what is important across the board. This bodes well for Indo-US relationship. It definitely bodes very well for Indo-US relationship. Economic cooperation needs to be as the key motivating factor between America and India, what I call the most prominent democracies. I don't say largest, oldest, biggest, strongest. I say the most prominent democracies in the world. Given that fact, that today Prime Minister in his Mann Ki Baat mentioned that India had hit a major century of 100 unicorns in India. So we are looking at India growing very rapidly, and it feels good to know that. And it feels good to know because we are all on the path to progress and prosperity for both nations. How do you see this evolving, the economic cooperation framework, Indo-Pacific economic cooperation framework? There are two sides to it. One side is optimistic. The other side said, same old, same old, same old. This is nothing else but a word play. Your thoughts on that, Nathan?
So my thought is it's probably somewhere in the middle. So there's a few things. So on the pessimist side, this is some of the things going against the recently announced, the recently unveiled Indo-Pacific Economic Forum or framework. At the end of the day, it's a framework, right? And the reason why that word, that use of diction is important is that because it's a framework, it doesn't require congressional approval. And what that reflects is that the United States protectionist impulses are bristling right now. And you can actually see bipartisan reluctance to consider any new free trade agreements This cuts across both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And it was most events when President Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So you know that free trade is very unpopular in domestic audiences in the United States. And for that reason, the Biden administration has opted for a framework because it's loose enough, the terms are elastic enough that they can then say this is not, this does not cut tariffs. This doesn't need congressional approval because we're not allowing these countries, in this case, India, Australia, and some of these dozen Asian nations, we're not giving them any market access anyway. Therefore, no congressional input is needed. And it saves the Biden administration, allows them to save face from a vote that would be very daunting. But on the other hand, there are some things in this framework that over time could, I think, as the flesh mounts on the bone, could be very substantive. I think, in recent years, we know India's had a long history of the license Raj, of protectionism, again, also very bipartisan in India. But you've seen a recent turn in India where since January, it's inked 2 free trade deals with Australia, the United Arab Emirates, and it's also signed on to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And I think part of it is because the key pillar of this is supply chain resiliency. And if you think about it, it comports very well with Prime Minister Modi's production-linked incentive systems, with Atmanirbhar Bharat. And if you think about it, these $26 billion of subsidies is helping to midwife an industrial ecosystem in India, helping these unicorns rise. And it's a very exciting time, I think, even though, the production-linked incentives are probably just 1% of expected corporate investment over the next 5 years. If India can attract these supply chains, India really sets itself up as an alternative to China and will look more reliable as a supplier to the world compared to China, which is now locking down its own people in Shanghai, disrupting global supply chains. India will help foster global supply chain competitiveness, resiliency, and really set an example for the rest of the world. And I think over time that can help lead to further deepening of U.S.-India trade and economic ties.
I think both Indians and Americans must welcome deepening economic ties between the United States and America, United States and India, because that's key to both. United States is the largest consuming nation in the world. India is the largest market in the world, along with China, for every product and service. And somebody who has been involved in the process, I have been telling all American manufacturers or business people that I say to, that whatever you are making in America, make your money. But by reaching India, you quadruple your entire market framework, because India has the ability to absorb everything that you make, provided you make it relevant. And that's true. Ambassador, coming to this element of, talked about freedom and control, supply chain management, which Nathan very, very correctly pointed out. China became the global supplier of the world for everything, virtually, from garden chairs to your expensive suit. Forget about watches and everything else put together. India, I remember the day very clearly. This was the day, I don't exactly remember the date, but this was the day I was in Indian consulate in New York. China's trade deficit, US trade deficit had hit $42 billion with China. I was told by some people, because I was at that point in time very involved in India's economic liberalization program and marketing it here, somebody telling me, why the hell don't you tell your Indian bureaucrats to take at least 10% of what is going to China? Because your bureaucracy doesn't allow the freedom of investment to American businesses in India. To that end, Prime Minister Modi has done an enormous job of opening up the economy. And I think he and External Affairs Minister, both of them have worked very hard on the perception and policy framework of India globally. How do you see this India becoming competitive with China to offer that supply chain element that Nathan was referring to, which, in my opinion, India can become, under Make in India banner or whatever, a global supply chain for the world?
Thank you, Vibhuti ji. That's a process which will only accelerate with time. In my experience as a diplomat in so many countries, I've heard this refrain from the leadership of many countries that they are waiting for India to become more proactive and India to start taking the leadership role. And they are not very comfortable dealing with China because of various reasons. The predatory loans, for example, which we have seen in Sri Lanka, Ambantota, where the economy has collapsed completely. Similar things are going to happen in some of the other countries. So, from that perspective, even the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is now being termed as the bribery and repression initiative by a large number of analysts all over the world. So that initiative is going to slacken very significantly over time. We have already seen that. For example, Japan offered, I think, an amount of $20 billion to Japanese industry to relocate from China into other countries, including India. Similarly, US is also encouraging its industries to relocate. The Indian administration under Modi has done very significant, sort of developments in this, advances in this regard, of putting in a huge amount of budgets for Atmanirbhar Bharat, etc. Now, another aspect which you mentioned about they could quadruple their markets, but one of the important ways of achieving that quadrupling is the rural population in India. The rural population in India, which is about 70%, which means about 897 million, which is 900 million, which is more than 2.5 times, almost 3 times the population of the US, and more than the population of the entire continent of North America and South America put together. That is the rural population of India. Now, a lot of thought and effort has to go into that. I may mention, with your permission here, about a very big conference which is being held in India in November by the IIT alumni, the Wheels Global Foundation, and the Stanford University and the Banaras Hindu University in November this year, November 11th, 12th, 13th, where a lot of leaders are also expected to participate. And the topic of the conference is rural transformation for economic growth. How can the US and other countries contribute towards making this, development paradigm for the rural countries all over the world, and also creating markets for industry all over the world? So that is the focus, and how to make this not just a conference, but a movement later. So the Modi administration, with its Skill India program, Make in India program, and the emphasis it is placing on its relations with the US, because the India-US partnership, once it becomes the defining partnership of the 21st century, then we will see a lot of progress being made very fast. And if it is done in a bona fide way by the two sides, then the pitfalls which happened in US relations with China will not be there. And it will be a very, very healthy and prosperous relationship, not only for these two countries. India's population is probably already the maximum in the world. It is beyond 1.4 billion and beyond China's today. So to have a country which is the most populous country in the world, which is one of the most important drivers of the global economy already, partnering with the US will create a sort of a new paradigm for the world for the future. And that is where we should be headed even faster. Thank you.
I agree with you. I mean, there is no other option but for the US. However, whatever your compulsions may be, the diplomatic or military compulsions may be, you cannot ignore India anymore. or put India on a back burner, sort of. But important part here is in my opinion, is that we need to assert ourselves. What we see in Prime Minister Modi's leadership is an assertion of a kind of a global globe trotting all over the world to create a new perception of Indian culture, traditions, and values, which is what is helping India today. Nathan, on this subject matter, as a part of the Indo-US initiatives that you are part of, what are you exactly looking forward to doing between the two countries? I mean, I'm very happy Pradeep Kapoorji has mentioned that the conference is happening on November 11th, 12th, and 13th, which is post-election. So hopefully I win. I will. I hope I'm able to
We
travel.
will expect
So
your
work for you. Yeah.
participation. Yes, we will
Thank you.
expect your participation there.
Thank you. Thank you. Nathan, your thoughts on it. Key elements that the fissures that must be removed between India and the US part of it.
So I think if you look at, let's dissect the key pillars of the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So one of them is going to be, one of the pillars that the Biden administration said would be digital trade. The other one would be supply chain resiliency, climate change and infrastructure, number 3. And then number 4 would be tax reform. So, I think right there you have these 4 pillars. There's a few frictions that I think could emerge between the US and India. I think on one of them could be on the fair economy pillar. The Biden administration has been pushing for a global tax treaty and a minimum corporate tax rate across the world as part of kind of tax equalization and harmonization. So if, for example, the Indian government ever wanted to cut corporate taxes further, I could see some frictions emerge on that front. I think the other mine that could, like a tripwire that's out there is on digital trade. I think it's safe to say that there's been some disputes on India's data localization laws. And to the extent that they're an impediment to, American payment processors like Visa, MasterCard, vis-a-vis RuPay. So I think that could be another issue at hand between the US and India where I don't think relations will ever get acrimonious in any way, but certainly there's going to be not exactly seeing eye to eye on that. I think there should be a 5th pillar in there, or maybe it should be nestled in on this clean economy thing. And I think this is where I think there's a key deficiency in the IPEF framework. And it's on energy. India is going to be one of the largest consumers of hydrocarbons in the world. The United States recently has become the largest exporter of crude petroleum in the world. I think there's a clear match between India's demand and the United States' supply. And I think for India to grow, it needs a stable source of energy, especially like clean natural gas. And I think this is where this was the Biden administration giving a fillip to the environmentalists, to kind of the green lobbies in the United States and in kind of the Western NGO world, where they didn't focus on kind of the oil and gas trade, which I think was a big miss here. This was a missed opportunity, and I think they could have inked maybe some long-term purchasing agreements with India to give India a stable source of clean natural gas that is much, at least it emits less than, 80% of the same emissions that coal does. It would help both tackle climate change, and it would allow India to grow and have less smog in Delhi. So I think this is something that I wish the Biden administration hadn't caved into the environmental lobby on. And that's something that I think needs to be worked out, because even if we the best for climate change, we achieve net zero in 2050, we're still going to be using, as a society, as a global society, 1/4 of the oil we use today and 1/2 of the natural gas we consume today each year. So this is something that I think in U.S.-India relations should actually focus on. That's something that the Trump administration was very good about.
Yeah, I mean, on the economic front, Trump did something phenomenal with India, establishing an equation. Pradeep ji, last question of the day we have 30 seconds left now. India it gives me an impression that somewhere along the line, the Biden administration wants to punish India somehow or the other for whatever reasons. That we know the reasons why. Where do you find the conditions of satisfaction that United States must make sure that the line they don't go beyond? That's very important. And the same question to you, Nathan, as well, when your turn comes. 30 seconds for you, Ambassador. Which is that line you can't go beyond?
Well, there is a lobby here, which we all know about, which is always going to be insisting on that sort of, steps, those sort of steps. But in the greater overall interest of the two countries, I don't think it'll lead to much, really. Their efforts will continue, but they have to be somehow tackled and completely sort of put aside in the greater objective, because there is absolutely no possibility. Are we still there?
Yes, we are there.
Yes, okay. Absolutely no possibility of, the world or the two relations not really becoming important, because as India says, chalenge hum saath saath. So Nathan has pointed out very well the US perspective. Let me try to very briefly put forward the Indian perspective. The Indian side will never agree to a subordinate relationship with the US. It has to be a relationship of equals. That is not what the US is used to with other countries, with other regions. So that is one adjustment which has to be made. Secondly, when we talk about renewable energy and clean energy, one of the most important pillars of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is exactly that. It says decarbonization and clean energy infrastructure. One of the most important pillars of the Quad also is exactly that. And one of the most important pillars of the current Modi administration, not just pillars, it's one of the most important global initiatives taken by this administration, was the International Solar Alliance in COP21 or whatever in Paris, where 120 countries joined for clean energy. And I was there in New Delhi in 2015 or 2016 when a conference on renewable energy, all this new energy, there were about 100 companies, including many from America, which made very significant promises of many gigawatts. And the Prime Minister of India mentioned that we have to move from the phase of talking in megawatts to gigawatts. And that is exactly what has happened in India. India is the fastest growing renewable energy power in the world today. The rate at which it is accelerating in India. Yes, if you have a population of 1.4 billion and your development efforts have been set back by colonialism, by invasions, for that population to get energy, to be able to prosper, to develop is an essential requirement. Now, the green energy being
Thank
made.
you, Ambassador. I will have to take the last word to Nathan, and very valid points. Nathan, 30 seconds, your last word.
What's the question again?
Question is, what are the conditions of satisfaction?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing the U.S. can't do is slap cats as sanctions on India. I think that would be immediately derail a lot of progress that we've made. And it would actually jeopardize U.S.-India relations. And I think it would be foolish of the U.S. to do that. It would turn the Quad into the triad in no time.
I totally agree with you. We have had one very fascinating conversation on CATSA. And about 8 or 9 months ago, I had opined in my analysis of things that CATSA has many exit options, and US will apply that, and India will not be put under CATSA, which I totally agree with you, will be disaster for the relationship between the two countries. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you, viewers, for being with us. Thank you for the support. Come back again. As the saying goes, I always say, truth will triumph. Satyamev Jayate. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Ambassador.
Good ambassador.
Thank you. Bye-bye.